Hello and welcome. Just so you know, the folks that are in the audience, we are live streaming this event, and so there's a camera over here, and we will have about 40 minutes of Monica talking, and then we'll have about 20-25 minutes of conversation. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and introduce myself and set the kind of the context for things. So my name is Julie Coiro. I teach in the School of Education, and I'm co-director with Renee of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Literacy, which is a new program that we have here at the University of Rhode Island. I was going to thank David Bird, who should be here shortly, who's our department head, for giving us the flexibility to run that program. And as part of that program, this is I'm going to call it a lecture series, even though it's the first, because we do hope to have this be the beginning of the conversation. So I also wanted to thank Don Halquist, who is the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Rhode Island College, who has come all the way from the other side of Rhode Island to join us tonight in the rain. We have some folks here who have attended our Summer Institute. So why a session on personalization? And I'm not going to say too much, except to kind of set the scene of where we kind of got started in this. And if you've been around in education for any amount of time, you've probably figured out there's ideas that come and go, there's pendulums that kind of swing, and often the decisions that we make, particularly when they get to the policy level, have the ability to influence the kinds of things that happen and the kinds of things that probably don't happen. And so as we have been working in our certificate in digital literacy and thinking about the role of the teacher and what happens when you bring technology into it, we have really been thinking about good practices, thinking about what we used to call perhaps individualization back, 20 years ago. And then it kind of moved into this idea of differentiation, where we started to kind of change how we thought about instruction and how we might make it kind of different and personal for certain students. And then of late, this term personalization has kind of come onto the scene. And one of the things we've realized is that there's a whole lot of differences in terms of how people are defining it. In particular, there seems to be at least two ways that people are thinking about things. So when you have people and you have computers, the computer actually can customize instruction in a way that could be valuable. And a lot of times the teacher plays the role in creating some digital playlists and kind of using the computer to really help customize how that information is served up to students. And then we also have this piece about this personal connection, this human connection, so if computers are here, what role do teachers play? And how do we keep kids talking? Do we keep kids talking? Is there value in that? And so really the reason that I think we're here tonight is to think about some kind of healthy balance, if those were two ends of the continuum, and I'm not sure they are, but really I look at a little bit of the work from Mark Prensky, and he talks about digital wisdom and how do we make use of computers and how do we make use of people, and what's that healthy balance? I think the other reason that we're here tonight is because there's not a lot of research to support most of the things we're talking about at either end of the continuum, or perhaps even in between. And so our hope here today is to open up the conversation to somebody who has been spending a little bit of time reviewing the work that's out there to help us think about what role does the teacher play, what role should the teacher play, how do we prepare pre-service teachers, what's most important for learners, and how do we define learning in a way, is it computers that can help, is it people that can help, what do we currently know, what's still important to know, And how can we tap into all of our expertise to try and set a research agenda that if we are interested in moving toward really fulfilling the personal, individualized needs of students, what's the best way to do that? So I'm going to let Renee introduce Monica as somebody who's going to help open up the conversation, and then we'll hear from other folks to see where do you sit on the issue.
Thank you, Julie, for setting the stage. My name is Renee Hobbs, and I have the great honor of introducing Monica. I've been reading Monica's work long before I got the chance to meet her a couple of years ago at South by Southwest, where we did a podcast or something together, and it was just wonderful. But we're so delighted and honored to have her in our community this evening. Monica Bulger is a researcher at Data and Society Research Institute, which was founded by Dana Boyd. She leads the Enabling Connected Learning Initiative. She's a research associate at Oxford Internet Institute, and she's a fellow of Fundación Ceibal, studying the impact of educational technology in education. Her work with UNICEF, the EU Kids Online Initiative, the European Commission, and the Berkman Center on Internet and Society at Harvard Law School have clearly led to her being a leading international expert on children's rights in a digital age. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Monica Bulger.
Thank you, and thank you for coming out on a rainy evening, and I hope I live up to the wonderful description. Thank you so much, Renee, and the great scene setting. Thank you so much, Julie. It's an honor to be here. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
I'm just going to turn.
How's this? Better? Better?
Nice.
And hello, everybody online. Okay, so, whoa, is it too loud now? Or? Okay. So each of us sitting in this room are here because we care about education, even more so because there was sort of the rain element, so it feels like we did an obstacle course to be here. But why do we care? And why are educational issues so much in the news? A colleague asked me this. And education is promising, it's hope. It's the promise of not only a good future, but a better future for our children. Through education, we believe that any child can transcend his or her circumstance. No matter where or how you start, there is possibility for success. We believe that education democratizes opportunity. We don't just expect learning from our education system, we expect transformation. It is here that our children, our teens, even our 20-somethings, spend the majority of their time. It is here that they learn to learn, build friendships, establish foundations for adulthood. With so much expected from education, it's no wonder that it's an emotional issue. With such high stakes, we can be neither objective nor uninvolved. We're talking about children, our children, and we're talking about their future. It's no wonder that since the beginnings of the one-room schoolhouse in the US, the education system here has been in a constant state of reform. That's the one thing we can count on the education system for absolute certainty, future and past, that it's in a constant state of reform. Given the expectations, the high emotion, and high stakes, it's no wonder that we're constantly testing new ways to improve our education system, that we're in a constant state of dissatisfaction, that we expect better. We want education to transcend income levels, resources, home life. We want education to transcend history. So we get caught in hype cycles as we seek the panacea, the cure, the single fix that will make education better. Recent hype cycles have included blended learning, flipped learning, and most recently, personalized learning. Flipped classrooms. Looking out into our audience, I think I see school children of the 70s and 80s. So maybe some of you remember phonics and UMath. And for those of you from school children from the 90s, you might remember magnet schools where there was a focus on art or tech, and you could go to a special school for that special skill or talent. And then parents of children in school children in the 2000s might remember character counts, right? So up next is exploring the potential of virtual reality and its potential for empathy instruction. That seems to be something that's now a buzzword. Regardless of which of these trends we're following, we continue to try and find a solution that prepares our children for successful futures. So hype cycles aren't necessarily bad. They prompt a focus on a single dimension of student learning and promise improvement. And who doesn't want students to be more engaged, to have an easier time learning math or reading, or to have more individualized experience that addresses their specific needs? What is important here is that hype cycles tend to overpromise benefits of a particular approach, but can also have backlash of overstating potential risks or dangers. Tonight, we're going to look into the promises and concerns around personalized learning from an educational research perspective, because that's what I bring. And so what does the research say about personalized learning? Well, let's start with definitions. As Julie mentioned, there's a lot of different terms being used to describe personalized learning, and it's promising a lot. And sometimes personalized learning feels like a celebrity. There's a lot of rumors, and it's hard to know what the truth is. So I'd like to just define it that independent of technology, personalized learning describes adaptation to a student's unique combination of goals, interests, and competencies, and the ongoing process of shifting instruction as these conditions change. And I read that just to make sure I would get the points right. So even without the use of new data-driven learning technologies, every teaching environment is in some way personalized, and I see a lot of teachers in the room. So you know that everyday interpersonal interactions involve a degree of personalization as people respond to each other's shifting moods by reading facial expressions. For example, right now looking at you, a lot of you are looking back at me, or you're taking notes, or you're tweeting. So standing up here, I'm taking that as engagement. And so I would adjust my lesson if all of you were looking down or looking outside or looking around the room to try to bring you back to attention. So wait, I just lost my place. Oh, so in classrooms, teachers rely on their interpersonal cues combined with their subject matter expertise, knowledge of how people learn, and knowledge of each student to determine individual needs. And that's how they're adjusting their lesson in response to questions and behaviors, as most of you do. This broad definition of this kind of student-centered learning instruction, or learner-centered instruction, is what Gates and Rand used in their 2014 and 2015 studies to show the benefits of personalized learning. So it's important to start looking at these studies that do exist and figuring out when they're focusing on actual learning platforms and when they're relying on kind of tried and true, already tested methods of strong instruction and learning practice. So technology-enabled personalized learning describes varying degrees of tailoring or customization of a learning experience through apps or platforms. So I'd like to note that to date, there are very few studies that test the truthfulness of vendors' claims about the potential for personalized learning platforms. This isn't to say that they may not be promising and that the claims may be accurate or not, but we currently have no way of knowing. Likewise, the systems themselves are closed. What that means is researchers, teachers, school administrators do not have access to kind of a special sauce or how the actual system is working. So we don't know how they calculate student scores, build individualized learning pathways, what goals they're directing students towards. These remain open questions. And what that causes is uncertainty. It causes uncertainty for us in determining whether to adopt them, and it also causes uncertainty for parents in knowing whether to trust the schools in adopting them, whether to trust the systems, whether to trust those systems if they're being used in their homes. And that uncertainty can create fear. So it's very important that as much as possible, vendors, teachers, school administrators, all of us in this ecosystem, figure out a way to make these systems as transparent as possible. Okay, so as an educational researcher, I have a few questions related to the soundness of claims of learning benefits. And I have 7, but I'm going to try to narrow it to 4, depending on how much time we have. So the first one, and the most important for me, is where is the evidence that differentiated instruction? And so this is individualized learning, this is personalized learning. The word differentiated instruction was sort of the traditional term in the cognitive science literature, so I'm going to stick with that, improves learning outcomes. So where is the evidence that differentiated instruction improves learning outcomes. It would seem obvious that it does, right? Because we've been talking so much about personalized learning that it would seem that it's a given that it's good for students. So differentiated instruction was defined, I found in the 80s even, as the recognition of students' varying background knowledge, readiness, language, preferences, and learning and interests, and a response to that. So that sounds very similar to personalized learning, doesn't it? So this is something we've been aiming for a while. It was found to be a conceptually sound approach in a 1988 overview of the existing literature of the time. And I'm using that as a benchmark because the study was done by Jer Brophy, who's a very reliable researcher, and they did quite a bit of quantitative and qualitative analysis. But they found that while it's a conceptually sound approach, it placed a heavy burden on, a heavy responsibility for learning on the learner, which we think is a good thing, right? To have students own their learning. And however, I'm going to quote them. They said that such independent learning demands a combination of functional literacy, direction following skills, independent learning skills and habits, and sustained concentration and motivation that is almost non-existent in the primary grades and likely to be seen only in a minority of students in the intermediate and secondary grades. So we're placing responsibility on students for skills they may not have developed yet. In an evaluation for the Department of Education in 2003, researchers found that while dimensions of differentiated learning, so I'm going to use ed terms, and if you want more of a description, put up a hand and I'm happy to describe them, but things like guided feedback, zone of proximal development, learner-centered instruction, okay, cool, they independently are very promising, but when you put them all together, the total package with students working independently, how much teacher support, the quality of materials, there wasn't empirical validation that in combination these worked. So this remains an open question. And while there's a number of testimonials and classroom examples on corporate websites, there still lacks a systematic study of this type of instruction. My second question, and I like to ask this for any technology that's coming into schools or any technology as kids are using. What are the unintended consequences? That's the question I like to ask. And here I'm going to ask it for autonomy and social interaction. Because the thing about personalized learning is it becomes awfully impersonal, right? You're individualized, you're really interacting with the computer, and you're interacting through type, you're not talking. And for the most part, unless the teacher makes an effort to make it a social experience, it tends to be individualized as promised. So what are some consequences for autonomy? A risk is that with the wealth of data that's being collected by these systems, so this data includes the demographics, how much time the kids are spending, it can start to build a complete learner profile of all the questions you've gotten wrong in the past, everything you're reading. There's a danger that with this wealth of data available to track and report students' progression, it will translate into a laser focus on numbers and performance metrics. And the thing is, we don't really know how to understand those, right? Parents are getting text messages now that say they got a 60 today. Well, is that a 60 out of 100? Is that a 60 out of 60? Is that a 60 out of 200? What do I do with that? And what do you do with that tomorrow when they get a 120? Now is it 120 out of 125? How are parents supposed to respond to this, and how are teachers supposed to respond to this? So let's get to the kids' independence here, because when parents and teachers become involved in trying to urge students toward a particular outcome, and we're not even sure yet what that outcome is, that's a little bit unclear, but let's say it's performance. This is getting quantified daily, and the focus becomes then on the score or on finishing a module or a particular set of modules rather than the process of learning itself. There's a danger in initiating a feedback loop in which the student may perceive that if they don't achieve an A or a particular score or completion, that they'll fall out of favor with the teacher or with their parent, because now the parent's even more engaged than possibly before. This scenario pits a desire for competence, which is in research, there's certain indicators of children's sense of well-being, and one of those is competence. So it pits a desire for competence against concerns around relatedness, and relationships and relatedness is another key indicator of sense of well-being. So students may pursue the performance goals in an effort to achieve a score to please parents or teachers, which is something that they were doing already, right? But this might become something that tech tends to do. It makes things visible, it also accelerates things and can exacerbate them. So this might become problematic for more children, or it might become just an accelerated process. And so the focus might become on the numbers rather than the value of the process or in working hard. And we're all familiar with Carol Dweck's research on the importance of the process and of celebrating the commitment to working hard rather than necessarily the outcome or the goal. Student motivation is another essential topic in learning research, and studies show that it's an essential skill for academic success. The practice of self-regulation, determining from your progress what else is needed. And this is learning to learn. This is also learning to measure where you're at and where you need to be. Now, if a system is now telling you where you need to be next, we don't know how much that's going to impact our own gauges for that. I can tell you already that I rely more heavily than I expected to on Amazon's recommender engine. It's so right on so often, and I've even tried to kind of confuse it, that I wonder how much I'm not going and looking for other things. I don't know. A lot of personalization makes life more convenient, and I don't know if we're aware necessarily of how much autonomy and agency we might be giving up in this process. And so for kids learning how to regulate themselves, this might be particularly damaging. And I haven't seen any research addressing this question, a study that looks at kids using a system and not using a system in terms of how they make decisions about when they're doing their homework, which homework to do. And I think we should mention here, part of studies of motivation are learning strategies, and highly skilled learners, highly skilled learner, wait, is it high-performing learners or highly skilled? Sorry. Their strategies may not look right to an algorithm. They might not read everything. They might skip over things. They might access things at the last minute. They might skim. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of learner strategies that are actually very sophisticated that don't look that way to an algorithm, depending on who programmed that algorithm, right? Because the people programming the algorithm may not be aware of learner strategies, or they might consider their own strategies to have been successful, or what the ideal should be. So we need to be aware of those learner strategies and consider how those might be being modified by the programs. Another concern is the Silicon Valley startup mentality being applied to schooling. And this is important. First of all, we know that very few startups succeed, and we don't want to have that same ratio for our schools. The Silicon Valley model works really well for tech development because it's kind of a failure is totally okay. We'll iterate, we'll test in the field. It doesn't need to be perfect when it gets out there, and these kinds of things. This was actually, I'm remembering now, this has been talked about in a John Oliver episode if you want to look on YouTube, but it's a really important point that we can't afford the kind of failure that happens for startups in our schools. So how can we minimize that? And you know, we're going to fail. I mean, that's part of the whole experiment that we're doing here with learning, but we need to test it more. I mean, these programs are going in untested into schools, which, you know, is fine if it's a computer program in some cases, but not necessarily in schools. Another question I have is, what are the algorithms optimizing for? In education, even in this room, if I were to ask you what the priority was for, say, a 4th grade classroom, we would have probably 15 different responses, right? Are we preparing them for 5th grade? Are we preparing them for life? Are we preparing them for the workforce? Are we preparing them to be internationally competitive? Are we preparing them to be responsible citizens? Depending on the answer to that, the thing about an algorithm is just a piece of code, and it's dumb code. It's the programmers who make that code happen, and it's the data that feeds that code. So it's important to realize that that unless it knows what it's optimizing for, it's very difficult to have a successful system. I don't know if that makes sense, but basically, if you have classrooms have multiple goals, and if we can imagine, as so many of you are teachers or administrators, you know, it's so hard to meet the different goals. Like you know, there's also the behavioral goals, there's class management goals. So depending on what those are, we need to be clear about that. If we want this whole thing to be successful, we need to have a clear understanding of what success means. And that's a challenge. And while I'm talking about that, I highly recommend Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, if you haven't read it already. And some points she raises that she's raised also in her Math Babe blog is, first, I'd like to talk about proxy measures. So in personalized learning, in any of these learning systems, a choice is made about what to measure. And most of those choices are made, the majority of those choices are made without being in discussion with teachers, right? Teachers just inherit these measures without necessarily having any input. So, for example, and proxies are just proxies, and sometimes proxies, we forget that they're just proxies, and we take them as actual measures. And there's been a lot of pushback on the Common Core for this reason, and basically any standardized tests, right? But there's a definite contingent who feels that those do not measure learning or do not measure what we need measured. I'm not taking a position on that up here. I just wanted to raise that's an example. But an example for a personalized learning system is if you're measuring engagement. How do you measure engagement on a system? Amount of time you spend, right? Maybe when you access it. And I see people making faces because, well, amount of time you spend doesn't say, you know, how engaged you are, right? Or when you access it doesn't say how engaged you are. I was, you know, in college, I was definitely the student accessing it at the last possible minute and possibly not reading all of it, if I were being honest. But I did well in school still, which I don't know if that's more of a reflection of school or me or what. But what would the algorithm have said? The algorithm would have probably predicted failure. So we need to consider what's being measured and how it's being measured. And if this measure for engagement might be off, what else might be off as well? So proxies, and then transparency. So as I said before, we don't know what's being measured, and so this definitely needs to be something that we ask questions about. What is being measured? What is being collected? Why is it being collected? How is it being used? Very important questions. The Data Quality Campaign has an excellent guideline for this for student data use generally that would very much apply here for personalized learning. Future Privacy Forum has also been doing really interesting work in this area. And while we're talking about algorithms, Julie mentioned the technology fix. I think that's what you were describing. And I think this is a very compelling idea that there will be one type of fit, one type of solution for these problems that we haven't really been able to resolve. In my paper, I talk about Isaac Asimov's vision, the science fiction writer, his vision for personalized learning, which basically has this idea that once we all have access to computers in our homes, and once we have access to the world of information, we really have unlimited potential. And the potential is to follow our own bent, is what he describes. Now, the question here is, how does the algorithm measure that? So how do we follow our own, like, what does following our own bent mean? And is that even something we really want to pursue? Following our own bent, in his example, might mean that a love of baseball, a love of, paying attention to the different teams would lead to a love of statistics, right? What if that love of baseball just leads to a love of baseball? Is that enough? What if a love of baseball leads to playing baseball video games? Is that enough? What do we want for our kids, and what are we measuring for our kids? And since this is iterating, at what point does the algorithm decide that it's not a successful venture? So for education and learning, success is long tail, right? We can't really, the kid in preschool who, we've had this challenge in like measuring like how museum visits might impact kids, or how public lectures, or how movies, or how different technologies might impact kids. And we really don't know how that 3-year-old, that 8-year-old, that 11-year-old, that 16-year-old, we don't really know until like 27, 32, 45, and what are we measuring there? Do we measure, so the OECD has measures for well-being. So, are you happily situated, whether that means married, whether that means single? Are you satisfied with whatever position you are in your life? Have you kept a job for a long period of time? Do you have relationships with other people? There's a series of well-being measures that are completely different from what we're measuring, which is a score on a science, a standardized science test or something like that. So what are those measures, and how do we sort of reconcile these iterative measures with the long-term measures? And this is what's so complicated and messy about education, is really success is long-term and really hard to measure, and it's really hard to pinpoint. Each of us right now, if I asked, who made a difference in your life? Can you name a teacher who made a difference in your life? All of you could. But was it that 3rd grade teacher, or that 5th grade teacher, or that high school teacher who really made the difference in your life? Maybe yes, but these are the stories we tell ourselves. And in reality, it was a lot of things. It was, as we know from education, the main predictor of academic success is the education level of your mother. So, and yet people succeed without mothers with high education levels, right? So, but so it's the family you were born into, it's the circumstances you were born into, it's your own particular amount of grit, it's whether or not you enjoyed studying and what you did about that if you didn't, or if you did. It's opportunities that you had. It's a million small little things that would be very difficult to pinpoint or quantify. And so how are we expecting a personalized learning system to accomplish all of that? I'm realizing I'm almost out of time, so that's those are some questions to get us started. And I have my paper available too. But I would just like to end on this point about the longitudinal endeavor, and with, given the limitations of technologies in determining the success of an open-ended process, which is what learning and basically life is, there's no clear outcomes until the outcomes are clear. So how are we measuring progress? What's going to be allowed in these systems? And what data or metadata are available to be part of that calculation? And thank you.
Okay, so now the conversation is open.
Yes.
Right? So what comments or questions do you have about this important and complex topic? Who wants to go first?
So, some of the conversations that we have
Is there? Oh, here, I'll be the mic. I'll be the Oprah. I'll move the microphone around.
Jamie,
I can speak.
You can do it? Can you do it?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not going to go very far.
So, some of the conversations that we've had that have to do with being overall personalization, those are more sympathetic to the role of technology. You see, what you talked about is mostly how and that. Do you see that spectrum? Do you see
Did everybody hear the question?
That should work. It's not a few minutes.
The question was that there's a broad spectrum of personalization and not all of it is tech enabled. And so in my work, am I considering the broader spectrum? And I think that's an excellent question. I keep using the example of Carrie Gallagher. She's a really amazing teacher using educational technologies at St. John's Prep School. And she described her classroom where she seems to be personalizing the personalized learning system in a way. She's figured out how to use it with the students. Like with the students, they figured it out. She empowers the students to figure it out with her and create their own learning plan in terms of what their goals are and how they want them to be measured and what their final product is going to be, and then works with the students in groups to achieve those goals. So the platform is there to provide like classroom management kind of information and to have the content available to students so that they have a wide range of content to choose from, but then it's personalized. So I find that those kinds of interactions are really powerful in terms of incorporating the tech into an already very lively and vivid, engaged classroom. Was that sort of what? Yeah, and so I know that I was problematizing the tech in my presentation, but I definitely see this as operating in an ecosystem where most of the interaction right now is non-tech. Yeah, thank you. And I saw. Yes. You don't have to take the microphone.
So I have a question. So that was actually really useful. So essentially this issue of, is personalized learning have to involve adaptive learning platforms? And either way, essentially we want to problematize the concept, maybe. My question is a topic that I don't know that I would like you to talk more about, is this issue of student data privacy and the way in which let's just say a kid uses one of the math programs, one of the personalized math programs for, just 30 minutes a day. All that data, you say, is in a closed system where the programmers can access it, the vendors can access it, but can the school district, can the parents, and who owns that data? And should we be concerned about a 6-year-old being trackable at the keystroke level every day for 45 minutes a day for K through 12? Is that something we should be concerned about, or is that really just, well, just like living your life online? Of course, all of us are trackable in a way too, right? And we don't worry. So should we be worried for our children when we're not that worried for ourselves? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I think that's a really a very well articulated question too, all of the different points. So thank you. First of all, I can't remember whether I've already mentioned this tonight, but schools have been collecting data on students for over a century here in the U.S. Did I already mention this? Attendance data. So since the schoolhouse, we've been taking attendance. There's been a need to determine resource allocation. Starting in the 60s, it became more of a focus on larger swaths of data, so getting demographics, being able to use data for academic performance, and also data on mental health and physical health to determine interventions. There started to be a focus in the 80s on dropout rates and also advancement to other grades. So schools have been using data for a long time to benefit students and to manage resources. So in that sense, the use of student data is not new, and even the sharing with third-party vendors is not new. Where people are concerned is not knowing how the larger data collection that's occurring on these different educational technology platforms might be being shared and aggregated. And the main concern there is not knowing what's being collected, right? Who it's being shared with and that sort of thing. So this goes back to my earlier point about uncertainty leading to fears. The main concern there is that data will be used to inhibit students' future opportunities. And at this point, we don't know whether that's a risk or whether that's a harm. So a risk is something that may happen, and a harm is something that has happened or that has happened. And so not all risks turn into harms. And so when we're talking about concerns here, right now that's a concern, but not, to our knowledge, a reality. So the goal here then is to demand more transparency from vendors so that we know what data is being collected about students, and we can communicate that information, to teachers and parents. Yes.
Right, to get that together and think about the teachers. So the child is nested in a classroom, assigned to a teacher, and so that data might not necessarily be just going toward the child, it's going toward the larger teacher. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And how does that all might work?
And did everyone hear the question? The question was, is this data flowing to the teacher? What data isn't flowing to the teacher? And my answer is I don't know. But a lot of the systems, their marketing materials state specifically that the data is for the teacher to help inform instruction. So how to, the marketing materials state that the personalization that is occurring in classrooms by the teacher, so the non-technology enabled personalized learning is occurring, isn't scalable, right? Like I can maybe personalize to 25. I can maybe personalize to 7, right? But I can't personalize to 30 or something like that. All of us who've taught know that, yeah, we can, but it's stressful. And can we do that to 90, and can we, so essentially these systems are, one of their benefits may be to help with this personalization. The amount of data going to the teacher versus not going to the teacher and going elsewhere is unclear. And the amount of data being shared outside is also unclear. So it may be that it's not really being shared with third parties. It might just be for the vendor to improve performance of the system. This is something that's an open question, and as long as it remains an open question, we're going to go to, whatever the worst case scenario is, probably, in terms of our fears and worries.
Are you concerned that it could be data that could be used for teacher assessment, right? Teacher effectiveness?
Okay,
right?
and so
how
that's,
what the kid
yeah.
does on the platform then redounds back, right? How the teacher is evaluated?
Especially in this, now we're in an era also of teacher evaluation, that's the latest reform, sort of, we're going to fix everything by evaluating teachers. So does that then become a question?
And I really encourage you, if you haven't read Weapons of Math Destruction yet, she talks about the Compass program in New York, where, okay, so there's a lot of nods. So where the algorithm's unclear and teachers lose their jobs based on how students are performing, and they did a comparison of a teacher who had a score in 7th and 8th grade, and in one case the algorithm said they were failing as a teacher, and in the other one said they were succeeding. Because when you, and I'm paraphrasing her, so I really recommend reading her because I might be getting this wrong, but when you tie, well, you know this, but when you tie teacher performance on academic performance, there's uncertainty in those measures, right? Because you don't know where the students are coming from, you don't know what they're capable of. There's quite a bit of uncertainty there, and there's also incentive to game the system then and cheat. And what happens then is that student gets put into somebody else's class, and they might fail in that class, and then that teacher inherits the low score on the algorithm. So I really recommend reading her book or listening to a podcast where she describes it, because it definitely addresses your concerns.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I was trying to summarize my thoughts and I have a lot swirling around. So to piggyback on that, and to piggyback on something you said earlier about we can't afford to fail, and as I'm trying to still formulate my thoughts, we can't afford to fail, but we have to create environments where teachers can take risks, and that directly impacts data for the teacher versus data of the teacher. I know because I lived and worked and built the evaluation system. One of the evaluation systems as they sit now as a system of support and feedback, period, the end. And so it seems like where as we're moving to a place, and I don't know if we're moving to a place that's very different, because we've had computerized systems for quite a while where we collect data. And so I think that the risk has always been there. We've had different assessment systems that pull information. As a parent, I've seen those information systems give me information about my child that was entirely useless and confusing. And so I'm trying to bring it back around to it seems like we keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's the chasing the silver bullet. And again, to go back to something you said, if we're constantly going to be in flux, but our investment is a long-term investment, it seems like we're almost always going to be doing the wrong thing. Because we don't know what our 20-somethings are gonna say worked, and even if they say what worked, it may not work now because it's 20 years later. And so I guess I'm not sure if that's a question or if it's an observation, or if you can speak to that. But it seems like just, you know, the people who've been in education a long time, when I first got there, said, don't worry, you're just every 5 years something's going to change. It's all going to change. And you know what? They were absolutely right. And so how do we get out of that swirl?
Thank you. That's a really excellent insight. But what I want to say is, why aren't we studying the 20-somethings? Why aren't we studying the 20-somethings for well-being? And why aren't we determining measures that we'd like to test our 20-somethings and our 30-somethings on, and see? And you know, we can weight those numbers for like downturns in the economy or overall unemployment rates or whatever, but why aren't we starting somewhere and starting to test, like I was part of the new math movement. I'm completely confused by algebra. I don't know if I'm alone in that. You know, it'd be great if we could be tested. You know, maybe it really worked, because I mean, we've got these really brilliant statisticians in my age group. So, you know, I don't know. I really don't know what the answer is, but why aren't we testing that? Why aren't we studying them to begin with? And I know that that's kind of a joke answer, because there's so much more involved in that. And you're right, it's a long-term thing, and I don't want to sound like we're on a course for failure no matter what we do. But maybe if we accept that too, it would, I mean.
Well, yeah, I don't think we've ever failed, by the way.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, I don't think we ever will, and I don't think we ever have, and so maybe that I need to sort of throw that out there, because.
And that, yeah.
I'm optimistic about what we're going to do all the time.
And that's the other side of it, is that we have this rhetoric that the educational system's broken, but we still have the best system in the world as far, I mean, sure, we can compare ourselves with Finland, but Finland doesn't have nearly the challenges that we do as a system. We have the highest proportion of kids under the poverty rate of any industrialized country, and we're educating them. We have more diversity in the classroom. We have in our classrooms, we have so many more challenges. And if we're ranking based on PISA scores, sure, but if we're ranking based on innovation, if we're, you know, what are we rating for? I mean, we're pretty successful. So I think, thank you for raising that. Wait.
So I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know that. So I think in response to the previous two things, I feel like, and I'm no literature review expert, but something I've definitely heard Renee and Julie say is that one thing that has withstood the test of time is like that relationships have made a difference, mm-hmm. right? So, and then I'm trying to relate the relationship thing to the data thing, in that all these platforms are spitting out data that's already interpreted for the teacher, but all of us who are teachers say, I know my kids, yeah. I know my kids better than that computer program. So I'm wondering if I'm hearing, like, understanding you and churning you the right way, in that, like, if these programs gave teachers raw data, would teachers interpret it differently, because they know that kid didn't have breakfast, that kid didn't sleep, that kid fought with his mom, that kid's mom's in rehab, or what, you know, like, the computer doesn't know those things, but we know those things if we're doing our job the right way. So I guess that's my kind of like open question, that if the data was given to teachers in a different way, would we be having a different conversation?
And I think that that's really important, to have input into how the data could be useful. I think there needs to be more of an interactive discussion about that, right? Yeah.
It's not really a question. It's just
Yeah,
interesting
there's a lot of
observation.
comments
Yeah.
there. Everyone wants to say something. I think just, and it's Eric kind of took part of it right out of my brain too. But you know, as teachers in school, you know, we were, I think, a huge part of our learning was this interpersonal connection and making, creating opportunities for students to be engaged and excited so that they love learning. And so we weren't trained as data analysts. Yeah. And so that's the other, I think that's the concern that I have is, you know, how do we as teachers have to shift? And is that a big lift on teacher prep programs? Is it a huge lift on schools to then do training
on math instruction?
Training to be data analysts so then we can then make sure that the students are plotted and places.
So that's how kids can interpret their own data. I mean, I feel like all this data talk needs to like go to math teachers, because if we have to teach kids how to interpret their own data, you know, and I heard it referred to as digital exhaust. Like it's just exhaust that we all put out there. We can't, just like a car can't help it, we can't help it. It's just how do we learn how to make sense of it all?
And then that goes into the arguments for STEM training and, you know, the knowledge worker. You know, there's a lot there too. Sorry, there's two hands back there.
I'll use big voice.
Okay.
I'm not here as a teacher, I'm here as a parent. And to me, this sounds very Frankenstein. The idea of my 7-year-old, my precious 7-year-old, being parked out in a cubicle with headphones on doing IXL all day is just a horror show. I can't imagine that that motivated my child to learn. What motivates her in the classroom is her teacher. She loves her teacher, Mrs. Brady. She loves her reading specialist. She loves the kids in the classroom. She loves collaboration. She loves posing questions. She loves thinking for herself. My kid's in class right now learning how to learn. I don't see an algorithm teaching her how to learn.
And
We do the IXL at home, and we do it as cozy, happy as you possibly can be, with her sitting on mommy's lap and her clicking and talking me through the thing and talking out loud. But being in a little cubicle as a little precious 7-year-old with headphones on, working down a playlist of what she's supposed to know, and then getting answers wrong, and then having to drill over and over again on the thing that you're particularly bad at, that's going to snuff the love of learning, not small children.
Thank you. And I think that that is a really good example of like hopefully a worst case scenario. And I think that right now what we're seeing in classes is that it's minimally used and informing teacher instruction. But this is a cautionary what we don't want to see in classes, right? That's the danger, and that's something we're trying to, we or they are trying to avoid. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of us have statements. I'll have questions too, but good conversation all the same. I think something that I wrestle with a lot, going back to the point on teachers needing to analyze data, be sort of, I mean, we talk about educators needing to be guidance counselors and nurses and you know, support staff and everything else that goes in, and sort of like more and more layers added on to a teacher in a finite amount of time. And becoming a data analyst adds just one more layer. And I am sort of just thinking in my own head now, and I don't have a great answer, about shared accountability structure. And so we talked about student accountability, but the parent accountability is also really important. And what you do with your daughter is really important, and you know, community accountability. But that also requires that we as educators are willing to open up, you know, that accountability to folks as well. And I think that is a really interesting push-pull that I haven't figured out how to deal with yet in my own head. But just, you know, calling out, and you're right, I don't think we should layer more and more on educators. But then that means that like we're gonna have to trust somebody else to do a piece of it too.
Thank you. And I had one here and then one there.
So you had a lot of questions at the beginning. So forth. You have a lot of questions at the beginning that really struck notes with me. And I think digital literacies and like the algorithm has added a lot of concern to those questions for me, but they've always been driving questions. You talked about all the different reforms. I'll throw in whole language and open classroom to your list, but they all work to some degree. It's such a great issue. Like you just can't keep throwing out the baby in the bathwater and and starting over again because they all work. You know, we have like PBL right now. The PBL community is embracing personalized learning like it's like, because it's one of the major tenets of project-based learning, but yet I've seen this where in some PBL high schools, students are not getting exposed to anything but what they're interested in. Because they come in saying, I want to know about cars. So all I'm going to do is internships and projects about cars for 4 years. You know, and even at college, we have living and learning communities. You know, like, thank God I wasn't in one of those. I didn't know I was going to have a passion for rhetoric when I was studying as an undergrad. You know, it got prompted by a really bad interview where they asked me what kind of training I had in teaching and writing, and I said none, because there was nothing going on in my English department like that. So that was my master's, you know, and bang, here I am, a 20-something, discovering, oh, this is what I want to teach, you know, and I don't want to take that away from them. We're telling them, and this is where this explosion, this information literacy explosion is happening. We're telling them, you now have more information at your fingertips than we've ever had in the history of humankind. And then we're putting a Carter on it with the algorithm, and they're being fooled, you know, in their ignorance. They don't have this plethora of information. They have this Carter of information that the algorithm's creating for them. And there just needs to be a lot of education, I think, of the culture of parents, of students. And I don't know where we start with that. It's a big job. Anyway.
Right there, and then Julie.
React to your idea of keep focusing on data analysis. Teachers, a lot of these algorithms, a lot of these systems would really like to be people when they grow up.
These algorithms would like to be people when they grow up.
But they reduce their world to things that can be handled through mathematics. And my background is in physical science. The first thing we do in physical science, we reduce a very complicated world into something that can be easily measured. What a teacher is doing with students is over many channels. It is very complex. It just doesn't go through a mathematical process. Every single teacher, and the research says teachers make thousands of decisions a day. Very complex, very multivariable. They just don't do it for frustration. So when you tell a teacher, oh, I'm going to give you a system that gives you raw data or lets you work with a spreadsheet, the veteran teacher will smile and go, yeah, I don't really need it. My processor is much more powerful. And a lot of this, I think, is people from the outside of teaching always being experts about what teachers do, but teachers are, what goes on in the classroom is very complex, and you know that. So I would be hesitant when I design the, plus, you know, over the last 10 years, teachers have analyzed huge amounts of numerical data, right? And they've been obsessed with the test scores. So it's not that they don't know how to use this data, but that what they're doing is very complex. You're talking about your daughter. What she gets from this grading is very complex.
Can't replace her.
So I wanted to just comment, I guess building on what Frank said, and in some way, shape, or form, I think all of us here are educators. And as we keep going forward, well, some of us are also researchers. And probably if you're a teacher, you're a researcher in a way anyway, because you're constantly collecting that data and rethinking what you're doing. And I'm hoping, and we're obviously not going to solve all those issues today, but to keep bringing educators around the table to figure out, rather than I think and we believe, and I think we need to collect some data. And we need educators around the table to figure out, as hard as it is to measure these personal things, my belief is if we don't measure them, we're going to lose them because they won't get into the mix of data. And so I don't know how we move forward as an educational research group. Here in the state of Rhode Island in particular, we are moving forward with an agenda. And wherever we sit, there isn't enough research to support any of those positions. And so I I really would like to use our energy and our brain power and our questions and our passion and our frustration to come to the table to say, what are those measures? What are those variables we think matter? And how could we measure them? Even if it's only qualitatively right now, even if it's only in a couple of classrooms, but then how can we start to scale that up, scale up the research, as opposed to let's scale up wide scale adoption of anything, because we really aren't sure. So that's my research / education pitch to kind of bring the passion that's here. And we could complain and we could be angry, but I'm hoping we can go further than that.
And I think given the size of Rhode Island, it's a very promising area to be researching, because, and I know that in reading the materials from the government websites that this is being considered a lab state, and that there are plans to be doing research around these questions that could even inform national uptake. So that's really promising. We have 2 more questions.
Partially based program for personalized learning and students, whether it's the one you're talking about.
I think that's a really good question. The question was, what's the size of adoption? And it's very hard to figure out because the vendors aren't really giving that information. They'll give testimonials and examples, but it's been very hard to find that information. There might be another way to get at it, which we're trying to figure out, maybe through surveying the IT leads at the schools or the CTOs at schools or something like that. But it's actually very challenging to find that information. It's a very good question, though.
Yeah, I think that to Julie's point of going to scale with this kind of movement, it's just like differentiation, where that was the word when I started teaching 15 years ago, and yet if I asked someone to define it, they wouldn't be able to do so. Or show or give any kind of. So if we're having this statewide conversation around personalization because of the state of Rhode Island, that's what we want to move toward. There's still differing understandings of what that means and how it can be viewed. Yet I think the state is looking to move in one very specific direction. You're saying just like differentiation, there's multiple ranges, and so. That's where I struggle with if we're going to nail it down to one thing. It's not, and I don't know. I'm concerned that there's going to be our hands going to be tied then to larger corporate actors, or things that you talk about, those hidden agendas.
I kind of want to suggest the definitional problem is a definitional problem either way. If personalization can mean anything, it doesn't mean anything. And if it only means one thing, well, then it's problematic as well. So it is we're in a complicated time right now, right? Because if the word means everything, then essentially I'm feeling a little bit, I don't know why you've increased my anxiety tonight, Monica. So, and I think Amanda and Jay had a lot to do with it. Okay, I blame you both. You both said to me, good teachers take a lot of data that is human, relational, observational, complex human interaction data, and they analyze it. But Monica, you said, think about your own experience when you go to Amazon to buy a book. Now, a recommendation engine does the presentation of book results for you. Do you still engage in the kind of search, in the kind of strategic exploration now that the machine does all the work for you? And the answer is no. I don't work as hard when the machine presents to me the algorithmically generated solutions. And that's really human nature, right? We tend to rely on tools that make things easier And so I worry, you've made me worry about something I didn't worry about before tonight, which is that platform-based digital platforms are actually going to make it easier in a way that teachers will love. And we'll all accept that path, which will ultimately kind of contribute to kind of a de-skilling. Teachers will have forgotten, how do I find science information independent of the tool they'll rely? Will come to be dependent on the Silicon Valley engineers who have created the learning platforms, and we will lose the ability to actually dig into the rich World Wide Web that we now take for granted, but that is increasingly more distant from us as these algorithms and platforms have replaced our genuine engagement with Web 2.0. So am I crazy to be more fearful?
And I think this is where we'll close because we're nearing the end, but you're reminding me of an ancient conversation actually between Plato and Socrates where there was concern that writing would cause us to think less, right? Phaedrus. And so I think that whenever a new technology is introduced, there's reason for healthy skepticism, right? We should be, and that's part of our digital literacy, media literacy, critical thinking, critical engagement. And so we should be asking questions, but we should also consider that we have power to change this, that as teachers, we decide. So I gave the example of Carrie Gallagher, who I'm just so amazed by, but all of you in this room, parents, teachers, administrators, we get to have input on how this is designed and how this is used. And whether that's through almost small protests by using it in the way you think is appropriate, or in speaking out, blogging, tweeting to vendors about what you would like to see, there's potential here. So I don't like saying technology is neutral anymore because we've seen that biases are embedded in the programming and in the algorithms. But the thing that's continued is teaching, right? Like teachers, there's been a war on teachers for a while now, and somehow, still standing and still excelling. And so I think that there's a lot of space here, and I think that considering the different arguments that have been made about technology over the years, when technology was just writing or when technology was just books is a good way to kind of frame this. So I'll be around to answer questions, and thank you so much for your input and your time.
What a marvelous way to conclude. Thank you so much, Monica. What a pleasure. We're so glad you came to join us tonight. Thank you so much for attending. We're going to hope to have more conversation about this in the spring, so stay tuned. Thanks again.